Няколко думи за Матю, който е един от визионерите в нашата професия. Европа догонва. Европа догонва в момента. Каквото и да си мислим, че се случва тук по отношение на отбраната и сигурността си. Въпросът е дали вече не е малко късно, дали не сме закъсняли, колко трябва да бързаме. Матю е журналист, който наблюдава важните световни процеси повече от 2 десетилетия между Вашингтон и Европа предимно. Бивш главен кореспондент на Европа на Политико, дългогодишен журналист в Wall Street Journal, отразявал е ключови събития като фалита на Lehman Brothers, предишната голяма финансова криза, започна с този фалит, както и дълговата криза в еврозоната. Днес той вече е главен редактор на Euractiv. Матю, заповядай. Thank you for joining us. Looking forward, and afterwards we will have a brief.
Well, thank you all for being here today. It's always a great pleasure for me to be in Bulgaria, and particularly in Sofia, and I always enjoy speaking to the sound of money. The last time I was here, I think I was speaking about the German economy, and somebody said to me afterwards that it was so depressing and negative that they wanted to take out razor blades at the end of the talk. So I want to be a little bit more positive today. I'm taking more of a glass half full approach to Europe's efforts on the defense front, which is something that everyone is talking about. The gentlemen here were just talking about it. Obviously, it's front of mind also in all of our political debates around Europe at the moment, and indeed beyond Europe in the entire Western world. Here, of course, we're focused primarily on what has been happening in Ukraine over the past several years, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and the implications of that. But I want to just give you a brief overview of what I would like to discuss here. I'm going to start with the geopolitical backdrop, as you can see, and then I'll circle around to some ideas about what this means for investors, innovation, especially in the European context. One thing that many people have probably noticed over the past several years, certainly since 2002, is that some of the best performing stocks in Europe have been in the defense sector for obvious reasons. I mentioned here Rheinmetall and Saab, although there's also, it should be said, there's a lot of volatility there, so these numbers might not be accurate at the moment, but certainly since 2022, we've seen jumps of over 1,000%, I think, for Rheinmetall, and Saab is also somewhere in that neighborhood, but you also have BAE Systems, Leonardo. I'm not recommending any specific stocks here, just to be clear, but just as an indication of how much money has been going into this sector just in the last several years since the all-out invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I think what's interesting to see is that more recently we have identified a new threat that I'm not sure most people have really internalized yet, and that comes from the war in Iran, of course, and something that happened in the first weeks of that war, which was a missile attack by Iran on the island of Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. Now, you might ask, why is this significant? Diego Garcia is very far away from Europe. The importance of this was that it was essentially a message by the Iranians to the world, and perhaps particularly to the Europeans, that their ballistic missiles could go much farther than anybody realized. Up to that point, there was an expectation that the ballistic missile program of the Iranians had a range of about 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers, which would have put, say, Cyprus, parts of Greece in range. But now they showed us they can send these missiles much farther, which means that they can reach pretty much any point in Europe if they wanted to. This is sort of the new assumption, I think, on the part of military planners, which is one of the reasons that I would argue that this shift that we've seen into military investment in recent years is going to continue, because there are new threats coming up all the time. And as Europe, debates its policy towards the United States, and as the United States continues on this trajectory, which all indications are it will continue on this, to withdraw from Europe, that Europe is going to need to step into this breach, because it's not just about Russia. There are myriad threats out there, and Iran is certainly one of them. We'll see what happens in the coming weeks with the war there, if the war restarts, if the U.S. and Israel succeed in shutting down the Iranian nuclear program. But these are all kind of big question marks at the moment. The other big question mark, as I mentioned, is what happens with Trump and the United States. I would argue that even if Trump exits the stage in a couple of years, which he is supposed to do according to the American Constitution, that the old days of the U.S. paying for European security to the degree that it had, or guaranteeing it to the degree that it had, are over, which is something that has certainly dawned on people in Europe, which is why we're seeing so much investment in defense across the board. I think the other issue that often gets lost in this is that Europe wants to be maybe not a superpower in the same way that the United States is, but they want to have their influence felt around the world. The Europeans want to be taken seriously by the likes of China, Russia, and so forth. And in order to do that, you need to have a credible military backing that. And whether that's one military or many militaries, you need to have some kind of military deterrent available to you. And as we've seen recently, Europe is very, very far from that. And there was a lot of frustration on the part of Donald Trump, for example, that the Europeans did not assist in this operation against Iran. Now, that had multiple reasons. One is that most European governments don't believe that this is a good idea. But leaving that aside, the other reality is that Europe isn't really in a position to help, except in some kind of symbolic way. The British, for example, recently sent a frigate to the Eastern Mediterranean. And in order to do that, they had to borrow another frigate from the Germans to fulfill their obligations to NATO in the Baltic Sea. So you can see just how stretched everything is. And without the United States, Europe quickly runs into very serious problems in terms of their naval assets, in terms of missile capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And this is why I put in this quote here: Europe has plenty of advice for the world, but almost no influence. This is just a sad reality, unfortunately. And I think that if you're talking about the Middle East, certainly you can see this play out in real time on any given day. I mean, there are plenty of pronouncements by all kinds of European leaders about what is going on there, but Europe doesn't have a seat at the table. And I think this is a dangerous development for Europe, not because of what is happening between, say, Israel and Lebanon, but because of the lack of influence that Europe has with the Gulf nations in particular, which continue to look to the United States for their security. But what Europe has done on the glass half full side is to dedicate significantly more resources to building defense capabilities in the coming years, and you can see some of these programs here. I've put them on the side. This is kind of an alphabet soup of acronyms. This is what happens when you have the European Union bureaucrats and military bureaucrats get together. It's a bit of a nightmare. But you have these various programs here. The first one, the big number, is the so-called Rearm Europe program, which is really, this is more of a target than an actual program. Most of that money, 650 billion euros of that, is essentially what European Union governments would be spending anyway on defense in the coming years. And in addition, and with an important caveat, which I've put at the bottom there, which is that they've been given extra fiscal leeway in order to improve their defense spending, meaning that they can spend more on defense without having to worry about the European Commission starting a deficit procedure or something like that against them. But of that 800 to 150 billion are these so-called safe loans, and this is new money coming in, and this is the type of thing that we are definitely going to see more of, which is why I'm pretty optimistic about the outlook for European defense contractors, because right now, depending on who you ask, but it's somewhere between half and 2/3 of European defense spending has traditionally been directed towards the US. Much of the spending, if you're talking about fighter jets, many countries buy their jets, as Bulgaria has done, F-16s from the United States, F-35s, and the reason for that is that they're just not available anywhere else at really at this quality and reliability. The French might disagree with that, but just to look at the challenge here, the French and Germans have been working for years on this joint fighter system. It's not just a fighter, it's an entire system for air defense that includes a fighter called FCAS, and that has basically imploded because they can't agree about who should do what after years and billions having been invested in this. And that is sort of also a warning sign that if the Europeans can't agree on these basic things, that they're going to continue to be completely reliant on the United States. But there is certainly, with this money, and there are some rules around it, that it has to be directed towards European defense contractors, which will help many of these companies. And if you think about things like drones, for example, we just heard on the previous panel, there's a lot of innovation in Europe in these new technologies. Drones aren't that new anymore, but they are taking the defense world by storm, obviously. And this is something I think where Europe can really excel. But I think in many of the more sophisticated systems, you're going to need to break these impasses like we saw in this joint fighter project. But there is new money coming into these all the time because people have woken up to the threats that we face. I was told this morning that this European Peace Facility, the so-called EPF, that's actually been increased now to 43 billion. So you can see that there's constant movement here, resources being made available. So what is the risk here of this trajectory being taken off track? Now, if you believe, as I would argue that it's in Europe's long-term interest to have a strong military capability across the board. That is seen controversially in many countries, if not most countries, by many people, and I think it's just a matter of time once the war in Ukraine ends, which will hopefully be soon, that you will see pressure then on governments to basically take their foot off the accelerator when it comes to spending on defense. Something similar to what we saw after the end of the Cold War. And the reason for this is that governments across Europe now are facing severe fiscal pressures, the population across Europe is aging. The demographic picture is becoming more and more complicated. You have more people going into retirement. Governments need to fill these gaps in some way. And if you're spending a lot on defense, you're not going to be able to spend on social welfare programs. Now, to put this into perspective, I mean, I think as everybody here knows, Bulgaria obviously doesn't have, Swedish-style, let's say, social welfare programs. But, Europeans, generally speaking, have become very used to generous social welfare. Some years ago, Angela Merkel pointed out, I think it was in 2012, that Europe accounts for 7% of the global population, a quarter of the GDP, and 50% of social welfare spending. And her point was that that is not going to be sustainable over the long term. So now, almost 15 years later or so, that calculus hasn't really shifted that much. I mean, GDP has fallen as a share of the global picture, but the European population is still about 7% of the global population, and the share of the global welfare spending is, I think it's come down, but it's still around 40%. So my point is that this is unsustainable anyway, but when you add the additional pressure of having to spend all of this money on defense to reach that 2% of GDP, which many countries, I think all the NATO countries are now spending, including Bulgaria, I saw, has brought that up in 2025. This is going to create a lot of friction in national governments, as there's pressure to do more for the retirees, for healthcare systems, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is a very big threat to this picture of more military spending. The other challenge that we face is that there are divisions already in Europe about what to do with Russia. There are countries that want to take a more conciliatory approach towards Vladimir Putin and Russia. There are countries that are more hardline on this. I mean, certainly if you look at the Baltics, as you know, Poland, etc. And these divides, I think, will continue, and this also filters into this defense debate to a degree. I mean, you're already seeing this, for example, in Germany in recent days, after the latest threat by Trump to basically abandon NATO, or signaled that NATO is useless, a paper tiger, whatever he calls it. That gets people very, very nervous. And one of the leading social democrats in Germany then said, well, we should then, because he also said he was going to withdraw these troops from Germany, 5,000 troops to start with, that Germany should make an overture to Russia and come up with some kind of agreement there. Now, that's not going to happen in the in the near term, medium term, probably also won't happen. But it reflects the kind of political pressures that we're seeing, and I think that this kind of debate will continue, and you'll see a similar debate with China, as countries say, well, the United States wants us to take a very hard line on China, but is that really in our interest over the long term? And this again will have implications for defense spending, I think, across the board, and this is why this point of EU fragmentation is very real. I would just add to that, in my experience, there is a bit of a disconnect between many countries in the EU and their relationship towards other members of the EU and the United States. There is this assumption, I think, amongst many Europeans that they are closer to other members of the European Union than they are to the United States. And I think empirically you can show that that's not true in every case. So there are countries, I would argue Germany, for example, is closer to the United States, more reliant on the United States in any case in terms of trade. The U.S. is still Germany's largest trading partner, for example. This is true of many smaller countries as well. So, are they going to risk that relationship because, something is happening with Spain and the United States. This is a current example where Trump has been attacking the Prime Minister of Spain, and we saw this play out in the Oval Office recently, where Trump said some nasty things about Pedro Sanchez, and Friedrich Merz was sitting next to him and didn't say anything, didn't defend Sanchez. And I think that reflects this dynamic. So I think, we should not forget this, that just because Europe is spending a lot of money on defense and there's concerns about the U.S. commitment, the relationship with the U.S. is so intertwined that I think there will always be this almost gravitational pull to try and accommodate the U.S. And we've seen this in recent days again with Friedrich Merz, who got into a bit of a verbal tit for tat with Trump, and he ended up basically completely backing off and apologizing to him. But just to sum this up, I mean, the point is that more defense spending, is going to put pressure on social welfare across the board. And the other thing that I have on here is the effect that will have on the bond markets, which means on borrowing rates. We're already seeing that in many countries, including Germany, again, the largest economy, where we've seen the economy stagnating basically since 2019, 2020. So I've got two kind of cases here that I've argued. I hope that Russia doesn't remain a genuine military threat for the foreseeable future, but the likelihood is that it will, and that means for these large defense contractors and for smaller defense contractors here, this is, unfortunately, for people who want peace, this is a very good environment for them. This is a very good time to be in the defense industry. And here again, as I was saying before, that the history suggests, though, that as soon as the pressure is off, that people will move on. And I'm not convinced that is very wise. It wasn't wise the last time around because it's much harder to catch up once you have done that. So, there are a number of other vulnerabilities in Europe that are connected to this, as we're all feeling at the moment, in particular energy. I know there are a lot of energy experts here. I don't need to give you the background on that. But I think, it's just worth remembering that over the past couple of years, Europe has done essentially a 180-degree turn when it comes to environmental policy with this Green Deal, as the European Commission called it. And this was during Ursula von der Leyen's last commission. This was the centerpiece of her commission, was this Green Deal, very ambitious targets across the board on climate-related issues. And in this term, in her current term, she's basically dismantling that because she came under massive pressure from the Germans and others to do so, because people began to see the implications of this. And whatever your view on that is, whether this is good policy or bad, I think there's no doubt that this has been very disruptive. And this is the type of thing that at the national level, in a national government, would have cost the prime minister or president their job if they have a centerpiece policy that doesn't work out the way they planned, and then they end up having to undo the entire thing. And Europe is a little bit more forgiving on that front, I guess, because Ursula von der Leyen is still there. She has a new commission. There is this, what I've called here, a vibe shift that we often see. We're seeing another one now, I think, with what is going on in the Gulf and the war against Iran, with the rise in oil prices in particular. And people are again worried, well, is this sustainable? Should we continue to be so reliant on oil from the Middle East? Should we invest more in electrification, which is probably inevitable anyway, but it's more about the pace and the scale. So you're seeing, again, this debate come up, and you can see it as a consumer. The sale of electric cars in many countries has now gone through the roof again as people watch the petrol prices go up and up and up. The other factor here in terms of investment, and this is one that I would argue is not really solvable in any reasonable time frame. This is the nuclear piece, which has gotten a bit more attention recently, and this is related to this question. Well, worst case scenario, if the U.S. no longer is willing to provide the nuclear guarantee to NATO, what does that mean? And there have been some deliberations around this involving France and the UK expanding that nuclear umbrella. This is a very complex subject, but I would just say this: the basic numbers on this, I've got them right here. This is simplified. These aren't the exact figures. The United States has a little bit more than 5,000 nuclear warheads, I believe. Russia has, I think, 5,500, something like that. But for our purposes here, this is basically where things stand. And the reason this is significant is, for people who grew up in the Cold War like me, you'll remember this idea of deterrence. The United States and Russia have kind of mutual deterrence or mutual assured destruction on this front. If the U.S. pulls back the nuclear umbrella, or Europe decides that, okay, it can't rely on the United States anymore, it doesn't really have a nuclear umbrella, because what the French have is designed to protect France, and what the UK has is designed to protect the UK. And so it's not easily transferable to other countries without massive investment. And I won't go into all of the technical details of this, but suffice to say that the Russian nuclear arsenal is also more sophisticated than what either the French or the British have. The Russians also have hypersonic missiles, for example, meaning that they can deliver these missiles very, very quickly. Some of them we hear are stationed in Kaliningrad, for example, meaning that they could basically, and I'm not suggesting that they would do this, but they could theoretically wipe Paris and London off the map within 5 minutes before anybody in either the UK or France, knew that this had happened or that it was about to happen. So this puts Europe at a major strategic disadvantage, this nuclear gap, and trying to bridge that gap would be extremely, extremely expensive, which is why you here, despite all of the abuse that European leaders take from Donald Trump, there's always this kind of, I think, realization that we need to keep him in the tent. We need to keep the United States in the tent, and I think that this nuclear piece is a big reason for it. That said, investing in all of these other areas, is a way to show the United States, and not just Trump, and I think this goes beyond him to the entire, basically, political class now, to show that Europe is paying its own way, that Europe is a serious partner, that it understands that, it has basically freeloaded on the U.S. security guarantee for many years. So, I think from an investment point of view, in the kind of short to medium term, obviously the duration of what's going on in the Gulf is very important. And the good news is we should find out how that stands, in the coming days and weeks. I mentioned the Green Deal reversal. This is another thing that I would keep a close eye on, because it feels like, people are veering the other way now after, going back to the internal combustion engine. If you remember, there was this decision by the Commission under the previous Ursula von der Leyen regime to phase out the internal combustion engine starting in 2035. They've now reversed that. And I can sort of imagine that people are going to revisit that in various ways, maybe not by banning petrol-powered cars, but by putting other limits on them that would make this transition a bit faster to electric. So the other big point, I think, in terms of the transatlantic relationship is the trade situation. as we've seen, there are continued tensions there. We had this deal last year in Turnberry, which has turned out to not be as favorable for the Europeans. It hasn't even gone into effect yet. Trump has now given the Europeans an ultimatum, I think, until July to get that through. So, these are all kind of important milestones that we should have some clarity on in the coming months. And despite all of this, the good news, I think, for the defense companies is that these are long-term investments. Their order books are full, and you're seeing again so much innovation also in Ukraine on the drone front and on the battlefield front. And I think it has also just changed people's perception across Europe. They say that there are no atheists in foxholes, and when you see the threats around us, it really is, I think, the best argument that this is an area where we need to continue to invest. And I've gone over the other issues. I'm running a little bit over time. I'm cognizant of that. So just to conclude, and my final recommendations here. As I said, I'm very optimistic about European defense because there clearly is a commitment to invest in European defense contractors. We're seeing that money flow already. These are long-term investments across the board. We do need to see more collaboration there. There's something like 40 different lightweight military vehicles across Europe, or 40 different suppliers, which gives you a sense of just how chaotic the system is. But this is the type of thing that needs to be dealt with, but people do seem to have gotten that message and are doing something about it. And I've gone over the other points there. So I will turn the microphone back and see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Matthew. Let's sit for a while.
Sure.
Thank you very much. We are talking every day, everywhere, about all these events. Is there European defense without the United States? What do you think?
I think in the short to medium term, the answer is no. There are divergent views about this. Some people think that there is. There was a report out earlier this week or last week by some German academics who were arguing that, in fact, Europe could achieve, if not strategic autonomy, but could be fairly autonomous from the United States in a much shorter period than most people have assumed. And they were saying, and it wouldn't cost as much. I mean, these numbers can be very difficult to grasp because you were talking about hundreds of billions of euros. I think I had one slide on there that showed that Europe spent 392 billion, I think, so let's call it 400 billion on defense cumulatively in 2025. That compares to almost $1 trillion that the United States is spending every year. But Europe doesn't need to spend $1 trillion because Europe doesn't have, the same kind of profile that the U.S. has with the global presence and everything going on in the Pacific, etc. So I think 400 billion is a lot of money, and that certainly should be enough for Europe to protect its interests on the continent. Can it survive without the United States? I think a lot of that will also just come down to the cohesion of the European Union itself. And, we have seen the difficulty on foreign policy of coming to agreements on things. We don't have a common foreign policy. We have 27 national foreign policies, and on the most important issues, there is an agreement. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that. And it's unfortunate what's happened in recent years with Trump, but I think if you look over the history of the transatlantic relationship, that the United States has really been kind of a linchpin there, kind of bringing countries together. It's no longer playing that role.
If we try another angle, is there European defense without Ukraine at the moment? I'll tell you why I'm asking you that, because Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, said several days ago that at the moment Europe needs more Ukraine than vice versa.
Yeah. Well, I'm not surprised that Stubb said this, given where he is.
Yeah, because he said they have stronger army at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, if you are a strong proponent of bringing Ukraine into the European Union, as he is, that I can see that argument. I don't know that it's empirically true. I think that Ukraine has a lot to offer the European Union, but it's worth remembering, it's a huge country. I don't need to tell people here that.
Yeah.
It has 40 million, or used to have 40 million people, and now has 20-some million because so many people have left. But the land mass is huge. It's very complicated. Integrating it would be very difficult. But I think just the fact that the Finnish president is saying that reflects the position that we're in. Finland has a border with Russia of
1,000
over 1,000, right?
Over 1,000.
And they have a history with Russia. They understand the threat that Russia poses. Now, if you were to ask people in Portugal that, you'd get a much different answer. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So geography is very important here on these questions. I think Europe will survive if Ukraine doesn't join, but I also think that the region would be more stable if Ukraine were a member, and not because of the military expertise, but just because of the common security guarantee. It would end, at least for the foreseeable future, this idea that Ukraine is part of Russia, that Russia, as Putin believes, has this kind of hereditary right to take over Ukraine and any other countries. So I think it's very important, because if he succeeds in Ukraine, obviously, he would be inclined to try somewhere else in a place like Estonia. And what we've heard from the United States and the Baltics is, Donald Trump saying, well, would we risk a nuclear war over, the Baltics? He's sort of putting this question out there, which suggests that no, he would not do that. So, this is the kind of thing that could really encourage Putin to go further.
You mentioned Russia. Let me finish with this question. Mentioning Russia, what about this desire from the past week that Moscow would negotiate with the European Union? How do you read this?
I think it's another diversion on the part of Putin. This was in the context of the May 9th celebrations. The Russian population is obviously under enormous strain, so it felt like he was trying to give them some kind of indication that, well, this isn't going to be going on forever. He also said that there's still a lot to do, if you look at the entire statement. And then he suggested that Gerhard Schröder become kind of the emissary of the European Union. Which is not going to happen. So it felt a little bit more like he was playing the usual Putin tricks that we're used to. I'm not very confident on that front.
Матю Карничниг, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Аплодисменти, дами и господа.